Hello, my lovely lunatics. Welcome to Adult Bedtime Stories. Tonight we're reading The Secret History of the World. We're on Chapter 16, The Tyranny of the Fathers. If you're not already subscribed, please do that. It helps so much. Smash the thumbs up button, ring the notification bell, and let me know in the comments what you're thinking of The Secret History of the World. Let's get into it. The Tyranny of the Fathers, the Gnostics and the Neoplatonists, the murder of Hypatia, Attila, and shamanism, a touch of Zen. A touch of Zen. Just like Zen, the art of archery. In the secret teachings of the schools, the life and death of the sun god marked the halfway point of the secret history. Although it was unnoticed by the official chroniclers of the day, at the end of time this event will come to be seen as the great hinge on which history is turned. To many people living at the time, the magnitude of this event undoubtedly made it hard to get into perspective. After a long period of spiritual ariety, many now began to enjoy vivid, atavistic experience of the spiritual worlds. Maybe some had an inkling of what the great revolution that had taken place in the spirit world signified, but in the absence of the sort of unified institutional authority that the hierophants of the mystery schools had exercised, these new experiences were interpreted in a variety of ways. We see this in proliferation of sects in the decades following the death of Jesus Christ. Many of the Gnostics' texts are as old as the books of the New Testament, some with clear claims to validity. We have already touched on the Gospel of St. Thomas with its more authentic versions of the sayings of Jesus and the Pistis Sophia's account of the two Jesus children. The somewhat fragmentary text of the Acts of St. John offers a fascinating glimpse of the inner group practices of Jesus Christ. A circular dance is described. The disciples first hold hands to form a circle, then whirl in a ring around Jesus Christ. In the liturgy that accompanies this dance, Jesus Christ is the initiator and his interlocutor a candidate for initiation. Candidate: I would be saved, Christ, and I would save. Candidate: I would be loosed, Christ, and I would loosen. Candidate: I would be pierced, Christ, and I would pierce. Candidate: I would eat, Christ, and I would be eaten. The Acts of John uses language in a paradoxical, even absurdist way. It will become easier to understand as we proceed. Candidate: I have no house, and I have houses. I have no place, and I have places. I have no temple, and I have temples. Only fragments of the next bit have survived, but they seem to refer to some Osirian Christian mystery of death and resurrection, after which Christ says, What I am now seen to be, that I am not, but what I am, thou shalt see when thou comest. If thou hast no then suffering, and thou shalt have the power not to suffer. A Hindu dance in honor of Krishna is described as a circular sunwise dance. The dancers twist and turn and wheel around the sun god in imitation of the planets. This should alert us to the fact that the Acts of St. John is inspired by a cosmic vision of Jesus Christ as the sun god returned. The Gospel of St. Philip refers to 5 rituals, the last and greatest being the ritual of the bridal chamber. Is this a ritual sexual practice like the ones that took place in the temples of Egypt, Greece, and Babylon? Later, the Church would want to emphasize the uniqueness of Christian revelation and distance Jesus Christ and his teachings from what went before. But to the early Christians, it was only natural to see Christianity as growing out of what had gone before and as a fulfillment of ancient prophecies. Many early Christians understood Christianity in terms of what they had been taught in the mystery schools of Egypt, Greece, and Rome. The early church father Clement of Alexandria may have known people who had known the apostles. Clement and his pupil Origen believed in reincarnation. For example, they taught more advanced students what they called the Disciplina Arcani, devotional practices which today we would classify as magic. Early Christian leaders like Origen and Clement were erudite, men participating in the intellectual advances of their age. The most exciting of these found representation expression in Neoplatism. Plato had pretty comprehensively converted a mind before matter experience of the world into concepts. What happened in the 2nd century AD was that what we now call Neoplatonists began to develop Plato's idea into a living philosophy, a philosophy of life, even a religion, with its own spiritual practices. It is important to remember that while we tend to consider Plato in a dryly academic way for his followers in the centuries after his death, his texts had the status of scripture. Neoplatonists saw themselves not as originating ideas, but writing commentaries making clear what Plato really meant. Passages which are today considered merely as rather abstruse exercises in abstract logic were used by practicing Neoplatonists in their devotions. They were concerned with describing real spiritual experience. On the delay in divine justice, Plutarch, who was heavily influenced by Neoplatonism, describes what different spirits look like as they are observed beginning their after-death journey. The deceased are said to be surrounded with a flame-like envelope, but some were like the purest full moonlight, emitting one smooth, continuous, and even color. Others were quite mottled, extraordinary sights, dappled with livid spots like adders, and others had faint scratches. Plotinus, the greatest Neoplatonist in the Alexandrian school, was a practicing mystic. His pupil, Porphyry, reported seeing his master in ecstatic raptures, unified with the One several times. Plotinus said of Porphyry, perhaps a bit dismissively, that he had not achieved this once. Neoplatonists, who came after them, Iamblichus and Jamblichus, put great emphasis on the importance of theurgic, this is to say, godly magical practices. Iamblichus leaving detailed descriptions of his visions. Plotinus elaborated an extremely complex metaphysic of emanations of the kind we touch on in Chapter 1. Neoplatonism influenced other traditions, especially by its systematic approach, particularly the Cabala and Hermeticism. Hermeticism and the Cabala are viewed by such scholars as respectively Egyptian and Hebrew-flavored Neoplatonism. But in the secret history, the Hermetic and Kabbalistic writings that began to appear at this time are understood as the first written down, systematized expressions of ancient and largely oral traditions. The Hermetica purports to have originated with Hermes Trismegistus, an ancient Egyptian sage. They were written down in Greek and collected at this time in 42 volumes. Yuri Stoyanov, a distinguished researcher at the Warburg Institute, recently confirmed to me that most scholars now accept their genuine Egyptian origins. The Hermetica were genially tolerant of other traditions, no doubt partly because of an underlying assumption that all traditions address the same planetary gods and open up the way to the same spirit worlds. In fact, it is possible to draw parallels between the numbered emanations of Plotinus, the gods of the Hermetica, and the spheres of heavens as described in the Pistis Sophia. In the Cabala, the emanations from the cosmic mind, the Sephiroth, are sometimes thought of as forming a sort of tree as they descend. The Sephirotic tree, the allegorical interpretation of scripture that emerged with the Jewish scholar Philo of Alexandria, opened up the shared structure of all religions. St. Paul hinted at different orders of angels, not only angels and archangels, but also cherubim, thrones, dominions, mights, powers, principalities. He was alluding to a system he evidently expected his readers to understand. This system was set out explicitly by St. Paul's pupil Dionysius the Areopagite. The 9 orders he described can be equated with the branches on the Sephirothic tree, and with the different orders of gods and spirits in the ancient polytheistic astronomical religions. For example, the powers of St. Paul should be equated with the gods of the solar system of the Greeks and Romans, the powers of light being the spirits of the sun, and the powers of darkness being the gods of the moon and the planets. The scholar of Jewish esoteric thought, Rebecca Kenta, has compared the ascent through the gates of wisdom on the Kabbalistic tree of life with Sulfi teachings and made connections between the Sephiroth and chakras of Hindu tradition. In all idealism, the philosophical system behind all religions sees creation in terms of descending series of emanations from the cosmic mind. But what is distinctly esoteric is the identifying of these emanations with the spirits of the stars and planets on the one hand and occult physiology on the other. It is this that leads to astrology, alchemy, magic, and practical techniques for achieving altered states. It is important to keep bearing in mind that we are not here talking about piled up abstractions, but lived experience. The 9 angelic hierarchies were sometimes divided up into 3 parts, and when St. Paul talked of being raised to the 3rd heaven, he meant that he had been initiated to such a high level that he had had direct personal experience of the exalted spiritual beings, the seraphim, cherubim, and thrones. Christianity was forced out of initiatic experiences and beliefs like these. The greatest of the church fathers, St. Augustine, was an initiate of a late flowering Persian mystery school called Manichaeism. Mani was born in 215 in the region that today we call Iraq. At the age of only 12, a being appeared to him. This mysterious being he came to call the Twin, revealed to Mani a great mystery hidden the role of evil in the history of humankind. Revealed to Mani a great hidden mystery, the role of evil in the history of humankind. He heard of the intertwining of the forces of darkness in the creation of the cosmos. He learned, too, that in the great cosmic battle between good and evil, the forces of evil virtually triumph. The cosmic nature of Mani's vision can also be seen in its syncretism in his account of the great events of history and the exalted parts played in them by Zarathustra, the Buddha, the Hebrew prophets, and Jesus Christ. The universalism of initiates tends to worry local tyrants. The initiates' heightened awareness of the forces of evil is also always open to misinterpretation. Mani was protected by 2 successive kings, but their successor persecuted him, torturing and eventually crucifying him. I entered my innermost soul and beheld beyond my sight and soul the light. Augustine's towering intellectual achievement was to give a comprehensive account of church doctrine in terms of Platonism. What is usually glossed over in conventional church history is that this account was based on the direct personal experience of the initiate. Augustine has himself seen with the mysterious eye of the souls a brighter light than the light of the intellect. He is not only concerned with eternal abstractions. His confessions show him tortured by a sense of time passing. In his often quoted phrase, "O Lord, make me chaste, but not yet," and also in his poignant cry in another moment of visionary experience, "O beauty so old and so new, too late have I loved thee," St. Augustine's sense of time passing carries over into an esoteric sense of history. Later, we will see the way in which he understood that these suggestive stages of the history of the world would unfold when we look at his prophecy of the founding of the city of God. This is also the age of the great Christian missionaries, having been captured and sold into slavery. St. Patrick later went on a mission to spread feeling for the sanctity of human life that Jesus Christ had introduced into the stream of world history. He fought to abolish slavery and human sacrifice, but he was also a wizard in the tradition of Zarathustra and Merlin, a terrifying figure casting all the snakes out of Ireland with his wand, casting out demons and raising the dead. Christianity was readily accepted by the Celts, St. Patrick overlaid. With historical knowledge of the life and work of Jesus Christ, the Celts' cosmic prophecy of the return of the sun god, Celtic Christianity would happily intertwine Christian and pagan elements. In Celtic art, intertwining motifs would also stand for the interweaving waves of light that characterize the first stage of mystical experience in all traditions. The fiercely independent Celts would continue to insist on the primary of direct personal experience of the spiritual worlds, and would develop esoteric traditions independent of Rome. Some of the beliefs and practice of these and other early Christians would come to be dubbed heretical by the Roman Church. When people care deeply about the same things, when they share what the existentialist theologian Paul Tillich called ultimate concerns, they are sometimes incredibly sensitive to different shades of opinion. Differences of opinion may lead to murderous hatred, so that my greatest enemy is not the alien conqueror coming over the horizon with bloody tears carved into his cheeks, but a brother or sister I rub shoulders with in the congregation. Sometimes, too, members of a congregation will try to ban beliefs, as had the Emperor Augustus. not because they believed them to be false, but because they believed them to be true. The history of the founding of the Roman Church and the dissemination through the good offices of the dying Roman Empire has been written both by the Church and by its enemies. The Emperor Constantine claimed that in the middle of the night, before he went into battle against rebels, he had a dream in which Jesus Christ appeared to him and told him to put the sign of the cross on his battle flag. With the inscription, "In this sign thou shalt conquer," Constantine obeyed, and the rebels were duly defeated. He declared Christianity the official religion of the empire, donating the Lantern Palace to the bishops of Rome. There were undoubted political benefits to this. The new form of consciousness that had been initiated in Jerusalem was spreading with great vigor through the empire, and Constantine capitalized on this by offering freedom to any slave who converted, and 20 pieces of gold to any who were already free. As we have seen, the Romans made a cult of cruelty. The imposition of power by one man on another, taken to its furthest extremes, was exalted. The Romans were ruthless, and ruthlessness was a manly virtue. So the Christian exaltation of meekness and humility turned everything upside down and inside out. The Christians clearly knew of new joys and satisfactions, new ways of being in the world. Consider how strange meeting a Christian initiate must have seemed to a Roman. Here was a new form of consciousness. Here were people able to live inside their heads. They were lit up inside by an enthusiasm and a certainty about spiritual experience. It must have been as baffling and intriguing as it was, hundreds of years later, for a pygmy in Papua New Guinea to meet a European explorer. There were whole new worlds behind those eyes. Constantine may have hoped the vigorous new religion would help slow down the decline of the Roman Empire, but he remained anxious about a prophecy in the Sibyan oracles that Rome would again become the haunt of wolves and foxes. He decided to try to thwart this prophecy by transferring the spirit of Rome to another location and founding an alternative capital. So from under a porphyry pillar, he dug up the Palladium, the ancient god-carved statue that, as we saw, had been carried from Troy from the founding of Rome. Then he reburied it at the site of the city that would be called Constantinople. It was buried under the same pillar, but now topped by a statue of the sun god, crowned with the nails from the true cross in the form of a sort of nimbus. The symbolism incorporating initiatic teaching regarding the sun god would have been understood by initiates of all religions, so it is perhaps slightly ironic that under the aegis of Constantine, the church began to suppress initiatic teachings and to reduce its esoteric teachings to dogma. In 325, the Council of Nicaea decided which gospels among the many in circulation were the real thing. Imperial edicts also forbade pagan practices on the orders of Constantine's sons. Women and children were force-fed, their mouths held open by a wooden engine, while consecrated bread was stuffed down their throats. When Constantine's nephew Julian came to power in 361, he reversed the tide of religious intolerance. Having been brought up a pupil of the Neoplatonist philosopher Imblicus, he well understood the mission of the being he called the seven-rayed god. He gave equal rights to all subjects regardless of their religious beliefs, and gave permission for pagan temples to reopen. Julian wrote a famous polemic against the narrow dogmatic Christianity that had grown up during the time of Constantine, which is why later Christian writers came to call him the apostle, meaning someone who discarded the faith. He believed that Christianity had been seeking to deny the reality of the gods he had encountered through initiation. Julian led a military campaign into Persia, just as the Greeks had besieged Troy to control the initiation knowledge hidden within. Julian wished to understand the secret knowledge of the Manichaean mystery school based in Persia. He knew enough to appreciate that the mission of the sun god was under threat, and that the inner mysteries of Manichaeism concerned the war between the sun god and Ahriman, or Satan, the spirit of materialism. But before he could accomplish his mission, Julian was murdered by a follower of Constantine, and a new Saturnine era began, when knowledge of true initiatic spirituality would finally be driven underground. The Emperor Theodosius began a ruthless policy of suppressing all disagreement with the imperial line on Christian doctrine. He confiscated the property of heretics and took over their temples. Statues of Isis were rededicated to Mary. The Pantheon in Rome has a sublime and cosmic beauty unlike any purpose-built church. This temple to all the gods was converted by Theodosius into a temple of monotheism. Theodosius closed down the mystery schools and in 391 besieged the Serapeum in Alexandria. This sacred compound, with a vast cloud-caped temple to Serapis, was one of the wonders of the ancient world. Inside, a statue of the god was suspended from the ceiling by a magnet. There were also libraries that housed the world's greatest collection of books. Fortunately, many books were smuggled out before the Serapeum was burned to the ground, and its sacred statues dragged through the streets. Finally, Theodosius turned his attention to the Neoplatonic school of philosophy based in Alexandria, foremost preserver of the intellectual legacy of the mystery schools. The great personality of Neoplatism at that time was a young woman called Hypatia, daughter of a leading philosopher and mathematician. She was educated in philosophy, maths, geometry, and astronomy. Her father had developed a series of exercises to make her body a fitting vessel for a brilliant mind. She loved swimming, horse riding, and mountain climbing. So she was beautiful, as well as clever, and she soon won fame as an inventor of scientific instruments, including one to measure the specific gravity of liquids. Only a few fragments of her writing had survived. But she was known far and wide as one of the most brilliant minds of the time. She attracted large crowds as a lecturer. Well versed in the wisdom of Plotinus and Imblicus, she explained in her literature how Christianity had evolved out of the teachings of the mystery schools, and she argued, like her father, that no single tradition or doctrine could have exclusive claim to the truth. One afternoon in 414, when Hypatia was leaving a lecture hall, a gang of black-cowled monks forced her from her chariot, stripped her naked, and dragged her through the streets to a nearby church. There they pulled her through the cool, flitting shadows to the altar. In an atmosphere perfumed with incense, they swarmed all over her body, her naked form now covered by black cloth, and they tore her limb from limb. Later they scraped the flesh from her bones using oyster shells and burned all her remains. The church was trying to erase Hypatia from history, just as the priests of Ammon had tried to erase Akhenaten. It is too easy to see the church as the evil repressor of free thought and to romanticize outlawed groups and antinomian schools like the Neoplatonists and the Gnostics. From its early history, the church had numbered among its leaders practicers of black magic and other initiates who have abused their supernatural powers for selfish ends. But it is equally true and much more important to say that from the time of St. Paul and St. Augustine, the great church leaders have been initiates of the highest order who have sought to guide humanity according to the divine plan outlined in this book. They knew that it was necessary for any understanding of reincarnation to be suppressed in the West. According to the cosmic plan, the West was to be the cradle for the developing sense of the value of an individual human life. On the other hand, the Neoplatonists, though they had continued the work of Pythagoras and Plato, converting into concepts the direct experiences of the spiritual worlds, seemed altogether unaware of the great revolution that had taken place there. In their writings, there is no trace of the gospel of universal love that Jesus Christ had introduced. Similarly, the Gnostic emphasis on direct personal experience of the spiritual worlds, as distinct from passive acceptance of abstract dogma, was in line with the impulse introduced by Jesus Christ, but many of the Gnostics were also vehement world haters in a way that ran contrary to the mission of Jesus Christ to transform the material world. Many of the beliefs that the Gnostic sects took from their adventures into the spiritual worlds were also quite fantastical. Not only did some Gnostics believe that Jesus Christ had not sunk so low as to inhabit a physical body, that he had lived on the earth only as some kind of phantom, but they also practiced bizarre extremes of mortification and debauchery as a way of disrupting their own despised bodily senses and gaining access to the spirit worlds. Some encouraged snakes to crawl over their naked bodies. Some drank menstrual blood, saying, "Here is the blood of Christ." And others believed that their sex magic would lead to the birth of godlike creatures. Others castrated themselves and boasted, I am deader than you are. Rome wanted to stamp out doctrinal differences. Christian conviction and moral purpose were useful for Constantine and Theodosius, unifying the empire and strengthening it from within, at a time when barbarian hordes were threatening it from the east. The steadily expanding empire in China had caused a domino effect across Central Asia and into Europe. Under pressure from a far east, Goths, Visigoths, and Vandals invaded parts of Europe, even reaching as far as Rome before retreating again. Then, in the second quarter of the 5th century, the nomadic Mongolian tribes were united under a great leader, Attila the Hun. He swept through the territories previously invaded by Goths and Vandals and built an empire which stretched from the plains of Central Asia to northern Gaul. He pushed into northern Italy and raided Constantinople. Attila, the Scourge of God, has become a byword for arbitrary but an eyewitness account of a visit to Attila's encampment by a Greek historian, Priscus, gives a very different picture. Priscus shows Attila living in a simple wooden house of polished boards, surrounded by a wooden enclosure. Woolen mats served as carpets, and Attila, yearly little father, received his visitors wearing simple linen cloths, unadorned by gems or gold. He drank moderately from a wooden bowl and ate from a wooden plate. He showed no emotion during the interview except when his youngest son arrived, whom he chucked under the chin and regarded with a look of satisfaction. It is also said that when Attila conquered the Christian city of Corinth, he was outraged to find a prostitute on every street corner. He gave them the choice of marrying one of his men or exile. If Attila was not the ravening monster of popular imagination, it is nevertheless true to say that if he had succeeded in overrunning the Roman Empire, this would have been disastrous for the evolution of human consciousness. The Romans feared Attila more than any of their other enemies. Attila would not allow his people to live in Roman territory or buy Roman goods. When he invaded Roman territories, he reversed Romanization, demolishing Roman buildings, and he also took thousands of pounds of gold from Rome in tribute money. When in 452 he finally had Rome itself in his grip, the emperor sent out Leo, the bishop of Rome, to meet him. The future Pope Leo negotiated a deal with Attila by the terms of which Honoria, the daughter of the emperor, would be his wife, together with a dowry of thousands more pounds of gold. At this point, Attila believed he had achieved his ambition to take over the Roman Empire and rule the world. Attila and his people practiced shamanism. In all battles, Attila was guided, wisely as it turned out, by his shaman priests. The great terror striking uproar of a Hun army going to battle was made up of the howling of dogs, the clanking of weapons, the sounds of horns and bells. All this was intended to summon battalions of the dead, the ghosts of their ancestors, to fight alongside them. They were also shamanistically calling on the group souls of carnivores, the wolves and the bears, to enter into them and give them supernatural powers. Because we have been considering the barbarian invasions from the east, this is perhaps a good place to pause to consider shamanism. The word shaman comes from the Tungus Mongol noun meaning one who knows. Shamans from the time of the barbarian invasions to the present had used a variety of techniques. Mircea Eliade has called them archaic techniques of ecstasy to work themselves into a trance state. Rhythmic drumming and dancing, hyperventilation, frenzied self-mutilation, sensory deprivation, dehydration, sleep deprivation, and also psychoactive plants, including ayahuasca, peyote cactus, the ergot fungus. Recent studies by William M. Bowden, professor of biology at California State University, and others have also made it look likely that drugs were used to induce trance states in mystery centers. For example, the kykeon at Eleusis and the blue water lily taken in conjunction with opium and mandrake roots in ancient Egypt. Scientists have also isolated an enzyme in the brain that induces these trance states. Research seems to suggest that 2% of us have high enough levels of dimethyltryptamine naturally occurring in the brain to give us spontaneous and involuntary trance states. It also seems likely that we all have higher levels until adolescence, when a process of crystallization takes place, cladding the pineal gland and impeding its function. For the rest of us, these ancient techniques or similar are necessary. Anthropologists have noticed that accounts of shamanistic experience across many different cultures show progression through the same stages. First, a blacking out of the world of the senses, and a sense of a journey through the darkness. Great pain is often experienced, as if the body is being dismembered. Second, a sea of lights, often a shifting net of geometric patterns, the matrix. Third, these patterns morph into shapes, most commonly snakes and half-human, half-animal creatures, often with pliable, semi-transparent bodies. Lastly, when the trance fades, the shaman has a sense of enjoying supernatural powers. The ability to heal, information about enemies, mind-to-mind influence on animals, and the gift of prophecy. This may all seem to fit nicely with the accounts of initiations in mystery schools that we have looked at. Greg Jacobs at Harvard Medical School has said that by the use of shamanistic techniques, we can work ourselves into powerful ancestral states of consciousness. But in the view of modern esoterics, the example of shamanism will only take us so far when trying to understand the mystery schools and secret societies. Many of the paintings produced by shamanistic cultures as records of their trances are startlingly beautiful, but they do not give the same magnificent, comprehensive panorama of the spirit worlds found, for example, on the ceilings of the temples of Edfu or Philae. Moreover, the beings encountered by shamans seem to be from the lower levels, rather than the more elevated planetary gods with whom the initiate priests communed. In the view of the modern esoteric teachers, then, all shamanism, whether that of the old Hunnic or Mongol hordes, or that practiced by the Sangama in South Africa today, represents a degeneration of a once magnificent primordial vision. Again, we see that in the secret history, everything is upside down and the wrong way around. In conventional history, religion's early stages were marked by animism and totemism. This developed into the complicated cosmologies of the great ancient civilizations. In the secret history, humankind's primordial vision was complicated, sophisticated, and magnificent, and only later degenerated into amism, totemism, and shamanism. Attila's tribespeople practiced a shamanism that gave them an access to the spirit worlds that many a churchman might envy, but it was access in an atavistic state. It ran contrary to the impulse of the evolution of human consciousness that had been developed by Pythagoras and Plato, and had now been given new direction by Jesus Christ and Paul. The aim of this evolution was a beautiful one, that people would be able to take joy in their individual intellectual strength and superiority, and that they should be able to choose to move freely, powerfully, and lovingly, not only through the material world, but also through the spirit worlds. Drug-taking is, of course, a big part of modern shamanistic practice, but it is forbidden by most modern esoteric teachers as a means of reaching the spirit worlds. The aim of these teachers is to achieve experience of the spirit worlds with intelligence and critical faculties as unimpaired as possible, indeed heightened. To enter the spirit worlds on drugs, on the other hand, is to do so without proper preparation, and may open up a portal into a demonic dimension which then refuses to close. When in 453, Attila prepared to celebrate marriage to a high-born, soft-skinned young woman. He already had hundreds of wives. He was a man in the prime of life and full of potency, about to oversee the end of the Roman Empire. The delicate early growth of a new stage of human consciousness was about to be nipped in the bud. In the morning, Attila was found dead. He had suffered a massive nosebleed. I believe because it is absurd. This famous phrase by the first of the Latin-speaking church fathers, Tertullian, influenced many theologians in the late 19th and first half of the 20th century. We may imagine how absurd life might have seemed to a citizen of the Roman Empire in the days of its decline. He lived in a disenchanted world, where the great spiritual certainties on which the civilizations of the ancient world had been founded seemed doubtful. They no longer corresponded to his experience. Pan was long dead, and the oracles had fallen silent. God and the gods seemed little more than empty, abstract ideas, while the really vigorous thought life was in the realm of science and technology, and the atomic theories of Lucretius and amazing engineering projects. aqueducts, drainage systems, and roads thousands of miles long that were springing up all around. Spiritual certainties had been replaced by harsh political and economic realities. Yet, if the citizen had been minded to listen to the inner promptings of his spirit, he might have noticed that this harsh and mechanical grinding of the wheels of necessity, this new way of the world, threw into relief something very like its opposite, something elsewhere called the nameless way. If this citizen had chosen not to shut it out, he might have caught suggestions emanating from underground streams of thought. At this critical juncture, we move from the age of the mystery schools to the age of the secret societies, from the directing of the course of history by the political elite to something much more subversive. Coming from below, a new mood was taking over the soul life of initiates, which may be traced in the life of God's Joker, Francis of Assisi, in Shakespeare's Fools, and in the gently undermining work of Rabelais, in Gulliver's Travels, Alice in Wonderland, and in the cuttings and pastings of Kurt Schwitters. In answers to a question about the meaning of Zen, a monk raised a finger. A boy in the class began to ape him, and then afterwards, whenever anyone discussed this monk's teachings, this naughty boy would raise his finger in mockery. But the next time the boy attended class, the monk grabbed him and cut off his finger. As he ran off crying, the monk called after him. The boy turned round to look at the monk, and the monk looked back at him and raised his own finger. At that moment, the boy was enlightened. This Conte Cruel is not a historical episode, but one of the classic fables of Zen, formulated at the time of Attila's nosebleed. The capacity for abstract thought had been developing for less than 1,000 years, inspired by Pythagoras, Confucius, and Socrates. Buddhism had spread from India to China with the visit of the 28th Buddhist patriarch, Adharma. Then in China, over the next 200 years, Buddhism and Taoism fused to create a philosophy of spontaneous, intuitive enlightenment called Tekkan, or Zen, as it would later come to be called in Japan. Tekkan brought a new cautionary sense of the limitations of abstract thought. The boy and his fellow pupils had been struggling to understand what the monk was saying. We may imagine them frowning with the effort to grasp enlightenment cerebrally, but the boy is suddenly enabled to see the world from the point of view of an altered state of consciousness. He is suddenly seeing the world from the point of view of the vegetable consciousness that is centered in the solar plexus rather than the skull. It is by means of this vegetable consciousness that we are connected individually to every other living thing in the cosmos. These connections can be visualized as tendrils of a great cosmic tree, and every solar plexus as a flower on the tree. In another way of looking at it, this vegetable consciousness is another dimension, the world between the worlds, and the gateway to the spirit worlds. It is a form of consciousness, the light beyond the light of the intellect. To quote St. Augustine, that anyone must slip into who wishes to become enlightened. The boy is enlightened because, from the point of view of this other form of consciousness, the monk's finger belongs to him as much as it does the monk. The normal categories of human head thought are inadequate to cover this. Laughter erupts when you suddenly see the cosmos upside down, inside out, and the other way around. At the beginning of the second half of the 15th century, a new sense of absurdity entered the world, and from then on the great initiates of the secret societies in the West as well as in the East would always have a touch of Zen. Under a strong ruler, Justinian, the Byzantine Empire expanded, even regaining territories from the barbarians. Justinian closed down the remaining schools of Greek philosophy, causing teachers to flee, taking with them text-like writings of Aristotle, including his new lost alchemic treatise. Many arrived in Persia when King Khusra dreamed of founding a great academy like the one that had inspired Greek civilization. In an intellectual ferment that took in elements of Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, and Hermeticism, the methodology of Aristotle was applied jointly to the material world and the spiritual worlds. So began the golden age of Arabian magic. All our childhoods are lit up by a vision of magic, of genies, magic lamps, and abracadabra. These stories began to weave their magical influence on the history of the world in the 16th century. There were rumors of automata and flying machines, and caches of self-generating gold, of powerful magic spells that would become collected in forbidden books. Soon the whole world would be under the spell of Arabia, as books of its spells were published far and wide, books containing the whispers of demons. And that, my lovely lunatics, is the end of chapter 16. Next time we read The Secret History of the World by Mark Booth, we will be on chapter 17, The Age of Islam. Thank you so much, my lovely lunatics, for watching the video. Let me know what you thought of this chapter. Subscribe if you haven't already. Smash the thumbs up button if you enjoyed the chapter, and ring the notification bell to get notified when we read the next one. Until next time, my lovely lunatics, goodbye!